The night was cold and silent. Evan was sleeping inside his small cabin on the edge of the settlement. The wind outside made the old wooden walls creak, and the occasional rustle of leaves broke the stillness. He was used to such nights living, far from the main colony, but tonight, something was different. A faint sound woke him, a scratching noise at the door. At first, he thought it was the wind or a loose branch, but the sound came again, sharper this time, like claws against metal. Evan sat up in bed, frowning. Wild creatures sometimes wandered close, but this was slower, almost hesitant. He grabbed his old flashlight from the table and quietly moved toward the door. His boots made soft thuds on the wooden floor. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low, almost pitiful whimper that sound made. His heart beat faster. Something or someone was out there, and they were not trying to break in. They were. Asking to be let in, Evan reached the door and hesitated. Opening the door at night was never a good idea on this planet. Predators hunted in the dark, but the whimper came again, weaker this time. He slowly unlatched the lock and pulled the door open a few inches. The light from his flashlight fell on a small figure curled up at his doorstep. At first glance, he thought it was some kind of alien animal. She had a fluffy tail, soft pointed ears, and silver hair that shimmered under the light. Her clothes were torn, her feet bare, and her skin pale from the cold. But then she raised her head, and he froze. It was not an animal, it was a girl. Her eyes were a strange golden color, glowing faintly in the dark. Her face was young, maybe 12 or 13 years old, though alien features made it hard to tell. She looked at him with a mix of fear and hope. When she tried to speak, no words came, only a weak breath that turned into a cough. Evan stepped back, unsure. He didn't know her, didn't know where she came from, and didn't know what trouble might follow her. The settlement had rules bringing. In strangers, especially aliens without documents, could mean fines or worse. But he also couldn't just close the door on her. Her thin body shivered violently, and her small hands clutched the edge of his doorstep like she was holding on for life. "Where's your family?" he asked softly, though he knew she probably didn't understand. She only blinked slowly, tilting her head at the sound of his voice. Her ears twitched at every little noise in the night. Behind them, the forest stretched into blackness, shadows moving in the distance. It almost looked like something was out there, watching. Evan glanced over her shoulder and felt a chill. The shadows were not just trees swaying, they were moving shapes. Tall, slow, and deliberate. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and opened the door wider. "Inside, now," he whispered firmly, making a beckoning motion. The girl hesitated, her golden eyes scanning his face. Then she crawled inside, dragging a small bundle tied with cloth as soon as she crossed the threshold. Evan shut the door and bolted it. The scratching sound outside returned, but now it was on the walls. Faint and distant, something was circling his cabin. The girl sat on the floor, hugging her knees and staring at the door. Her tail wrapped around her legs like a blanket. Evan crouched in front of her, trying to get a better look. Her skin had faint marks, thin, almost invisible lines around her neck, like scars from some kind of collar. She had been held by someone before. "And not gently? You're not safe out there," Evan murmured. She tilted her head again, not understanding the words. But she seemed to understand the tone. She relaxed a little, though her ears kept twitching toward every sound outside. Then, without warning, she leaned forward and curled up on the floor right next to his boots. Evan stood there, unsure what to do. He had planned to send her away in the morning, maybe to the colony authority. But something about the way she had appeared alone, shivering and chaste, made him pause. He couldn't shake the feeling that if he had left her outside, she wouldn't have survived until sunrise. Through the night, the scratching outside faded, replaced by silence. Evan stayed awake, keeping an eye on the door while the strange alien girl slept beside it. Her breathing was soft, almost like a cat's purr. He noticed her small hand still clutched his boot, even in sleep. As if making sure he wouldn't leave her, the cold hours dragged on. Every time he considered moving her to a bed, she shifted, tail tightening around herself by the time the first pale light of dawn crept through the window. She was still there, and Evan realized something strange. He had never seen anyone, human or alien, look at him the way she did when she first opened her eyes in the morning, like he was the only safe place in the whole world. He didn't know it yet. But the moment he opened the door to her last night, his life had already changed forever. The pale morning light slipped through the cracks in the cabin's shutters. Evan sat at the table with a mug of bitter black tea, staring at the small figure still curled up on the floor near the door. She hadn't moved much since last night, her tail wrapped tightly around her legs, her small bundle clutched to her chest. For a long time, Evan just listened to the faint sound of her breathing. It was steady, now much steadier than when she had first arrived. He cleared his throat softly. The girl's ears twitched. But she didn't lift her head. Instead, she peeked at him through strands of silver hair, her golden eyes half hidden. "Morning," he said quietly. Even though he knew she wouldn't understand, she tilted her head like she was trying to make sense of the word. Evan stood and walked toward the small stove in the corner. He had a little bread left, some dried meat, and a pot of reheated stew from last night. It wasn't much, but it would be better than whatever she'd been eating if she had been eating at all. He placed a bowl in front of her, steam curling up into the cold morning air. "Here, eat," he said, pointing at it. She stared at the bowl for a long time. Her ears twitched again, and she leaned forward slowly. Instead of grabbing it right away, she sniffed the steam like an animal, making sure it wasn't poisoned. Finally, she dipped her fingers into the stew, bringing a bit to her mouth. Her eyes widened slightly. And then she began to eat quickly, almost desperately. Evan watched her, his jaw tightening. Whoever she was, wherever she came from, no one should be this hungry. When the bowl was empty, she looked at him as if expecting more. He hesitated, then gave her the rest of his bread. She took it carefully, as though afraid it might be taken back, and chewed slowly this time. After breakfast, Evan opened the cabin door to start his usual morning work. The girl followed him instantly, stepping into the sunlight like she was afraid to lose sight of him. "Stay inside," he tried, making a pushing motion with his hands. She blinked at him, then took a step closer instead. Wherever he went, whether to the tool shed, the water barrel, or the woodpile, she stayed 2 steps behind. Her bare feet silent on the dirt, a voice called from the fence line. It was his neighbor, Rhett, an older man with a weathered face. Rhett's eyes narrowed when he spotted the girl. "That yours?" he asked in a low, uneasy voice. Evan shook his head. "Showed up last night." Rhett stepped closer, glancing at her ears and tail. "Careful," he muttered. "That's no ordinary stray. Looks like guild work." Evan frowned. "Guild work?" Rhett nodded grimly. "The kind they track and come for." Evan glanced at the girl, who was now half hiding behind him. She didn't understand the words, but she seemed to sense the tension. "Word of advice," Rhett continued. "If she's what I think she is, you don't want her here when they come looking." With that, Rhett walked away, leaving a trail of unease behind him. Evan turned back toward the girl. She met his gaze for a second before quickly looking at the ground. That's when he noticed faint, almost invisible marks on her neck against scars from something tight. He had seen similar scars before, on animals that had been collared for tracking. He wondered if Rhett was right, if someone had been keeping her like property. "Do you have a name?" he asked slowly, pointing at her and then at himself. "Evan," she stared, then pointed at him. "Safe," she said, the word heavy with an accent. Evan blinked, unsure if she was trying to say his name or simply calling him what she felt he was when he pointed at her. She hesitated after a long pause. She just shrugged, as if her name didn't matter. Any Maror had been taken from her by midday. Evan had tried twice to leave her in the cabin so he could work alone. Both times she slipped outside quietly and appeared at his side. He realized then she wasn't just following him, she was sticking to him like he was her only protection. And maybe, in her mind, he was, when the sun began to set. Evan found himself pacing inside the cabin. The sensible thing to do would be to report her to the guild office in the settlement. But the thought of handing her over made his stomach twist. If what Rhett said was true, the guild didn't rescue strays, they owned them. And an owned life was no life at all. The girl sat cross-legged on the floor, repairing a tear in her own sleeve with tiny, careful stitches from a piece of thread she had pulled from her bundle. Every so often she would glance at him, as if waiting for his decision. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was certain, she wouldn't survive out there alone. Evan sighed, rubbing his face. "All right." He muttered under his breath, "You can stay." For now, the words meant nothing to her in language, but the way his voice softened, the way he didn't push her away, she understood enough. Her tail wagged once, a small, almost invisible movement. Then she curled up by the door again, this time with a little less fear in her eyes. Evan watched her for a long moment before turning out the light. Outside, somewhere in the distance, a faint metallic hum began to rise in the night air. And neither of them knew it was the first sign the guild was already looking. The morning began, with a thin mist hanging over the forest. Evan stepped outside to fetch water from the barrel, his breath visible in the cold air. When he turned, he saw the girl standing in the doorway, watching him like a shadow. She didn't move until he motioned for her to come. She padded over silently, tail low but swaying slightly. He set down the water and crouched beside her. "You need shoes," he muttered. Noticing the dirt and scratches on her bare feet, she tilted her head, not understanding the words. Evan pointed at her feet, then at his boots, saying slowly, "Shoes." She hesitated, then tried to mimic shoes. Her voice was soft, hesitant, but it made Evan freeze. He hadn't heard her speak anything but safe before. He decided to try again, pointing to himself. He said, "Evan." She blinked, then replied, "Safe." As if correcting him. "No," he said, tapping his chest. "Evan." She frowned in concentration, then whispered, "EV?" And it wasn't perfect, but it was enough to make him smile the rest of the morning. He kept testing her with simple words. She learned water, bread, and fire. Though she pronounced them strangely, it was like teaching a child who already knew how to think, but didn't know the sounds. By midday, she even tried forming her own sentence, pointing at him and saying, "Safe." "Stay." He understood her meaning without needing more words. But their quiet practice was cut short. A strange sound drifted from beyond the trees, a low, mechanical hum that made the hairs on Evan's arms rise. He had heard it before, in the settlement, when guild search drones passed overhead. The girl's ears twitched sharply, her tail stiffening. She looked toward the forest, eyes wide, and whispered something in her own language, one word, fast and urgent. It sounded like hunters. Evan scanned the tree line. The hum grew louder, and soon, a glint of metal flashed between the branches. A sleek black drone hovered into view, its lens scanning the ground with a faint red beam. Inside, Evan hissed, grabbing her arm gently but firmly. She didn't resist. She bolted into the cabin like she had done this many times before. Evan shut the door quietly and pulled the shutters closed. The drone's hum passed over the cabin roof. Slow and deliberate, inside, the girl crouched in the shadowy corner, hugging her knees, her ears flat against her head. Evan crouched beside her, keeping his voice low. "They're looking for you, aren't they?" She didn't answer, but the way her breathing quickened was enough. The drone lingered for several minutes, its hum circling at one point. The red beam slid across the window frame. Evan held his breath, one hand resting on the girl's shoulder. To keep her still, finally the sound began to fade, the hum sinking into the distance until only the forest noises remained. She stayed frozen in place for a long time, even after it was gone, when she finally looked up at him. Her eyes were sharper, more focused, like she had just confirmed her worst fear. "Hunters," she repeated softly. Her voice trembled slightly. And for the first time, Evan wondered if she had been running for days before finding his door. That evening, Evan lit a small fire inside. The girl sat close to it, holding her hands out toward the warmth. Evan decided to try again, pointing. To himself, Evan, then pointing to her, waiting for a name. She was silent for a long moment, then whispered, "Lyra." It was the first time she had said it, and she said it so quietly it was almost like she was afraid the name itself could be dangerous. "Lyra," Evan repeated, and she nodded once. She reached into the small bundle she always kept with her and pulled out a tiny carved figure, an animal with long ears and a curled tail. She placed it carefully in front of him, as if offering proof of something. "Home," she said in a broken voice. Evan didn't need an explanation. He understood this was all she had left of wherever she came from. Later that night, the mist returned. Thicker than before, Evan stood at the window, looking toward the forest, somewhere out there. The hunters were searching, and now he knew their machines could reach even his remote cabin. Lyra lay curled up near the fire, but even in sleep, her ears twitched at every sound. He knew it was only a matter of time before the drones returned with something worse behind them. Evan made himself a promise that night: if they came for her again, they wouldn't find her here, but deep down. He also knew that running would bring its own dangers. For now, all he could do was keep her close and hope the forest stayed quiet for one more night. The next morning started quiet. Too quiet. Evan was chopping firewood outside the cabin when the stillness hit him. The forest, usually alive with faint rustles and distant calls, felt heavy and unmoving. Even the breeze had stopped. He paused, axe in hand, and looked toward the narrow trail leading to the settlement. That's when he saw them two figures walking side by side, moving with a slow, deliberate pace. They wore dark gilded armor, black and silver, each step kicking up a faint dust cloud. Slung over their backs were long rifles, the kind used for both hunting and enforcement. Evan's stomach tightened. Behind him, the cabin door creaked. Lyra was peeking out, her golden eyes wide. The moment she saw the armored figures, her tail dropped and she ducked back inside without a word. Evan didn't need to ask, she had seen them before, and she knew exactly what they wanted by the time the two enforcers reached his yard. Evan had set the axe aside and tried to keep his posture relaxed. The taller one, with a helmet that covered his entire face, stepped forward and activated a small device in his hand. A glowing hologram appeared between them. It was a perfect image of Lyra's tail, silver hair, and all rotating slowly in the air. "Have you seen this?" The enforcer's voice was deep and mechanical through the helmet's speaker. Evan glanced at the hologram, keeping his expression flat. "No," he said simply. "Haven't seen anyone like that." The second enforcer, a shorter figure with a scarred jaw visible under an open helmet, took a slow step forward, scanning the cabin. "You live alone?" he asked, his tone casual, but probing. "Always have," Evan replied. The scarred man's eyes narrowed slightly. He looked toward the door, and Evan felt his muscles tense inside. Lyra was hiding, but if they decided to search, she wouldn't have long. The taller enforcer deactivated the hologram and clipped the device back to his belt. "Be aware," he said. "She's dangerous property. If she comes here, you contact the guild immediately." Evan gave a slow nod, pretending to agree. The two exchanged a glance, then turned as if to leave. But just before stepping away, the scarred man paused, leaning slightly toward Evan. "Dangerous things hide well," he said softly. "Sometimes." Too well, then he followed his partner down the trail, their footsteps fading into the trees. Evan stood there until they were completely out of sight. Only then did he go inside and shut the door quickly, bolting it. Lyra was crouched inside the small storage pit under the floorboards, the wooden cover barely pushed aside. Her breathing was fast and shallow, her ears flattened against her head. Evan knelt beside the pit, speaking low. "They're gone." Slowly, she climbed out, clutching her small bundle tightly to her chest. "They take," she said in broken words, her voice shaking. Evan placed a hand on her shoulder. "Not if I can help it." She looked up at him, eyes searching his face as if trying to decide whether to believe him. In the faint morning light, he could see how much fear had been etched into her like it had lived there for years. For the rest of the day, they stayed inside. Evan kept the shutters closed and the fire small so no smoke would draw attention. Lyra didn't stray far from him, her tail brushing against his leg whenever she passed by. In the evening, he cooked a small meal, but she ate only half before setting the rest aside. When he asked with a gesture why she wasn't finishing, she just shook her head and pointed at him. It was her quiet way of saying, "You eat." Night fell, and with it came the sound of boots on gravel again. Evan's chest tightened. He moved to the window, lifting the corner of the curtain. The same two enforcers were back, this time walking slower, their heads turning toward every shadow. They stopped at his fence, speaking in low voices he couldn't hear. One of them pointed toward the cabin, and Evan's pulse quickened without thinking. He grabbed Lyra's arm and guided her to the storage pit again. She didn't argue. She slipped inside, clutching her bundle. And Evan closed the cover just as a knock came at the door. The sound was firm, deliberate. Evan opened it slowly, forcing his voice to stay calm. "Evening," he said. The scarred man's gaze swept over him, then into the room. "We're authorized to search," he said plainly, "just routine." Evan's jaw clenched, but he stepped aside. They entered, scanning every corner, opening cabinets, even glancing at the sleeping cot. The taller one's boots stopped inches from the storage pit. For a tense moment, he stood there, eyes on the floor. Then he stepped away, satisfied door pretending to be. Minutes later, they left again. Evan didn't breathe until their footsteps were gone. He opened the storage pit, and Lyra crawled out slowly, her eyes glistening not from fear this time, but from relief. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They just sat by the dim firelight, both knowing this could not go on forever. Evan finally broke the silence. "We're leaving tomorrow," he said firmly. Lyra tilted her head, not fully understanding. He pointed toward the forest, and then to her, safe. Far away. This time, she didn't argue. She simply nodded once, her tail wrapping around her legs like she was holding on to the promise. Outside, the forest wind had returned, but under it was a faint mechanical hum closer than before. The hunters were patient, and they weren't giving up. Asterisk Evan didn't sleep that night. He sat by the dying fire, staring at the map spread out on the table. The guild patrols were getting bolder first drones, now face-to-face searches, if they stayed. It was only a matter of time before Lyra was taken, and if what she had hinted was truth, that she had been bred for fighting, he didn't want to imagine what the guild would do with her. When dawn came, he had already packed 2 bags. One with food, water, and medical supplies, the other with tools, rope, and a small weapon, an old pulse pistol he'd kept hidden since his days in the militia. Lyra woke to find him stuffing the last of the bread into his pack. Her ears twitched in confusion. He pointed to the bag, then to the door. "We go." She hesitated, clutching her small bundle protectively. Then, without a word, she slung it over her shoulder and nodded. Evan had expected her to struggle with the idea of leaving. Instead, it seemed like she had been ready for this moment all along. They waited until mid-afternoon to move. That was when guild patrols usually shifted routes, leaving a brief window of quiet. Evan led her through the back of the property, past the woodpile, and into the thick trees beyond. She moved silently, almost too silently. Her steps barely touched the ground, her ears turning at every faint sound. It was then Evan realized she wasn't just following him, she was guiding him without even knowing it. When they reached the first ridge, Lyra stopped suddenly and raised her hand. Evan froze. In the distance, faint metallic footsteps crunched through the underbrush. Voices followed guild enforcers, speaking in clipped tones. Lyra motioned toward a narrow path hidden between two fallen logs. They slipped through, and within moments, the sound of the patrol faded behind them. They walked for hours. By the time the sun dipped low, Evan's legs were aching, but Lyra moved, as if she could keep going all night. Finally, they came to a steep rock face. Half covered in moss and vines, Lyra stopped and pointed to a narrow opening near the base. Barely visible in the fading light, Evan frowned. A cave? She nodded, motioning for him to follow. Inside, the air was cool and still. The walls glistened faintly, reflecting their small flashlight beam. It wasn't just a cave, it was carved. The marks of tools etched into the stone. Evan's footsteps echoed softly as they moved deeper. That was when he noticed strange symbols scratched into the wall circles, lines and spirals that pulsed faintly under the flashlight's glow. At the back of the cave was something even stranger. Half buried in the dirt was a long metal container, its surface dull with age. Evan knelt beside it, brushing off layers of dust and grit. It was heavy, but the latches were still intact. With some effort, he pried it open. Inside lay a cylindrical device no bigger than his arm, covered in the same glowing symbols from the cave walls. Lyra stepped closer, her golden eyes fixed on it. She whispered something in her language, her voice soft, almost reverent. Evan looked at her. "What is it?" She hesitated, then managed to words in broken human speech. "Not weapon." But if it wasn't a weapon, why was it hidden so far from prying eyes? Evan carefully wrapped it in cloth and slid it into his pack. Whatever it was, it felt important. Enough that the guild might be hunting her for it. He didn't ask her more, not yet. The walls of the cave seemed to be listening, and he didn't like the way the shadows seemed to lean closer when they spoke. They made camp just outside the cave, hidden beneath a thick overhang of rock. Lyra ate quietly, her eyes scanning the tree line even as she chewed. Evan studied her in the flicker of the small fire. She wasn't just a runaway, she was trained, alert, and far more capable than her small frame suggested. But beneath it all, she was still just a girl trying to survive. Later that night, the forest went silent again. From somewhere far off, a mechanical hum began to build. Evan's grip tightened on his pistol. Lyra's ears twitched sharply, and she looked at him with a wordless warning. They both knew that sound. The hunters were sweeping this sector, and the cave, safe as it seemed, might soon become a trap. Evan put out the fire and packed quickly. They would have to move again before the search line reached them. Lyra grabbed his sleeve, pointing toward a narrow ridge that led deeper into the mountains. For the first time, Evan realized she might know exactly where she was going. And maybe, just maybe, she had been leading him here for a reason. As they disappeared into the darkness, the hum grew louder behind them. The guild was close, but ahead. In the unseen places of the mountains, there was something waiting, and Evan had a feeling it was tied to both the strange device in his pack to Lyra's past. The mountain air was thin and cold. Evan's breath came in slow clouds as he followed Lyra along the narrow ridge. The moonlight turned the world silver. casting sharp shadows on the rocks. They had been moving for hours without speaking. The strange device in Evan's pack, pressing heavily against his back like it was, carrying more than just metal. At last, Lyra stopped, her ears twitching as she scanned the slope ahead. Before Evan could ask, she crouched and began scraping away loose dirt near a cluster of jagged stones. Beneath the soil, a small metal hatch appeared, its surface engraved. With the same glowing patterns they had seen in the cave, Evan frowned. What is this place? Lyra only motioned for him to help. Together, they cleared the hatch and pulled it open. A narrow tunnel led downward. The air inside warmer than the night outside. They climbed in, sealing the hatch behind them. The walls of the tunnel were lined with faintly glowing veins of crystal, casting soft light over the stone. Lyra moved ahead quickly, her tail brushing the wall as if she knew every twist of the passage. After a few minutes, the tunnel opened into a hidden chamber. It was large, enough for a small ship to fit inside, but instead of machinery, the space was filled with glowing murals carved directly into the stone. Evan stepped closer, running his fingers over one of them. It showed figures with ears and tails like Lyriastal warriors with spears of light standing against a massive shadow. Other panels showed children being carried away by ships that looked nothing like guild designs. Lyra stood before one of the murals, her head bowed. This, my people, she said slowly, her human words shaky but clear. Evan turned toward her. Your people? You mean they're all gone? She nodded once, then touched the mural with her fingertips. Guild. Take. Change, she murmured. The words were broken, but Evan understood enough. Her kind had been captured and altered. The image in front of them was not just history, it was a warning. She crossed the chamber and pointed to another carving. It showed a tall, armored figure holding the same cylindrical device Evan now carried. Heart, she said, looking directly at him. Evan tilted his head. Heart. She touched her chest, then the carving heart of Pack. Life, the meaning hit him slowly, wasn't a weapon. It was something vital to her people's survival, and if the guild had it, they could control or destroy whatever was left of her kind. Evan crouched in front of her, thereafter. You. Because you're the last one who knows where this came from, he said. She met his gaze for a moment, then looked away. I run, she admitted softly. No more fight. Evan shook his head. You don't have to fight alone. Any more before she could answer. A faint vibration ran through the floor. Evan's eyes darted upward. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the faint hum of machinery began to seep into the chamber. The guild had found the hatch. Lyra's ears flattened. Her tail bristling, she grabbed his hand, pulling him toward a narrow side passage barely visible behind a carved pillar. They moved quickly through the side tunnel, the hum growing louder behind them. Evan could hear faint voices echoing in the main chamber, now harsh, clipped guild commands. They had only minutes before the enforcers would search every corner. The passage led them to another hatch. This one, smaller and older. Lyra pushed it open, and they emerged halfway down the mountainside into the cold night air. They didn't stop until they were deep in a ravine hidden by thick overgrowth. Evan leaned against a rock. Catching his breath, Lyra sat beside him, her tail wrapped tightly around her legs. She looked at him for a long moment before speaking. You? Not like guild, she said slowly. Evan shook his head. No, I'm not in the business of owning people. For the first time since he'd met her. Lyra gave him a small, tired smile. It didn't last long. Her ears twitched, and she glanced toward the ridge. The faint red light of a guild drone swept across the rocks above them. They stayed perfectly still until it passed. Evan knew they couldn't keep running forever. The guild wouldn't stop. Not when they were this close to retrieving what they saw as their property. He looked at Lyra, her silver hair catching the moonlight. We have to make a choice, he said quietly. Either we keep running until they find us, or we turn this around on them. Her golden eyes met his, and for the first time, there was no fear there, only determination. She placed her hand over his pack, where the device was hidden, and nodded once. The choice was made, somewhere far above. The hum of guild ships circled like vultures. But in the shadow of the mountains, a human and the last Wolfgirl of her kind were planning something the hunters didn't expect, and this time, they wouldn't be the ones running. The night was colder than any they had faced before. The wind howled through the mountain passes, carrying the faint hum of guild ships searching the valleys. Evan crouched beside the small fire they had dared to light, his hands resting on the pack that held this strange device, the heart, as Lyra had called it, across from him. Lyra sat with her knees drawn to her chest, golden eyes reflecting the flickering flames. She looked calm, but her tail was curled so tightly around her legs it almost trembled. "They'll be here by morning," Evan said quietly. Lyra tilted her head, listening to the wind. She nodded slowly, as if she could hear the hunters' engines even now. "They want heart," she said, pointing to the pack. "No care me." "Only heart." Evan shook his head. "No, Lyra, they do care about you. You're the only one who can use it, aren't you?" She hesitated, her ears lowering slightly. "Yes," she admitted, "without me. Just metal." Evan's jaw tightened. That meant she wasn't just the last of her kind, she was the key to bringing them back, if the guild got her. They wouldn't just destroy her life, they'd erase her entire species. The fire crackled softly as the two sat in silence. Finally, Evan spoke again. "We can't keep running forever. If they catch us running, we lose. But if we choose where to stand, maybe we have a chance." Lyra tilted her head. "Fight." Evan gave a grim smile. "Fight, by dawn." The wind carried a new sound, boots crunching on gravel, the sharp click of guild rifles being readied. They were coming up the narrow trail toward the ravine. Evan and Lyra had already chosen their ground. The ravine walls curved inward near the end, making a choke point, one entrance, one exit. If they held that space, the guild would have to come straight through them. Evan crouched behind a rock, the pulse pistol steady in his hands. Lyra stood beside him, her tail flicking intense. Precise movements, her small frame looked fragile against the rising sun. But her eyes burned with a quiet fire. He glanced at her. "If things go bad, you run, take the heart, and keep going." She shook her head immediately. "No safe without you." The first shadow appeared at the mouth of the Ravental. Armored, rifle ready, Evan fired a warning shot into the rocks beside him. Sending shards spraying, the guild soldiers stopped for a moment, scanning. Then the scarred man from before stepped forward, his voice cold and commanding, hand over the girl, human. "You don't know what you're protecting." Evan's voice was steady. "I know exactly what I'm protecting, and you're not getting her." The man's visor glinted in the sunlight. "You think you can stop us?" Evan didn't answer. He just tightened his grip on the pistol. The first shot came from the guild side. It slammed into the rock beside Evan's head, sending dust into the air. Evan fired back, hitting one soldier in the shoulder and spinning him around. Lyra moved like a flash, darting to another rock and throwing a handful of sharp stones into the faceplate of another soldier. It wasn't enough to hurt, but it was enough to distract. The fight was short but fierce. Evan kept the guild soldiers pinned at the ravine's mouth. Lyra moved quickly, using the narrow ground to her advantage, but the guild had numbers. They began to press forward step by step. The scarred man raised his weapon, aiming straight at Evan before he could fire. Lyra stepped in front of him, tail bristling, and let out a sound that wasn't human, a deep, rumbling growl that shook the air. For a moment, the guild soldiers froze. Then something happened Evan didn't expect. The strange device in his pack began to hum. Glowing faintly through the cloth, Lyra's eyes glowed brighter, and she stepped toward the soldiers. speaking words Evan didn't understand. The hum grew louder, filling the ravine. The soldiers hesitated, glancing at each other. Even the scarred man took a step back. Evan realized it then. Lyra wasn't just the key to the heart. She was its living connection, and whatever she had just activated was something the guild couldn't control. The light from the device flared once, sending a wave of energy through the narrow pass. The guild soldiers staggered, their weapons dropping as their armor systems flickered. Lyra turned to Evan, her voice firm. Go. Now they ran, leaving the guild soldiers disoriented behind them. By the time the soldiers recovered, Evan and Lyra were already deep in the forest. They didn't stop until they reached a high ridge overlooking the valleys below. The guild ships still searched in the distance. But for now, they were far away. Evan dropped his pack. Breathing hard, Lyra sat beside him, looking out over the horizon. You could have left me, she said softly. Evan shook his head. That was never an option. For a long time, they just sat there, the wind tugging at their hair. Finally, Lyra rested her head against his shoulder. Her tail curled around his leg. Safe. Always, she murmured. Evan looked at her and smiled faintly. The fight wasn't over, but for now, they had chosen each other, and that choice had made all the difference.